Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 205, Sempach, the Death of a Duke and the Birth of a Nation, which is also episode 3 of season 11, The Fall and Rise of the House of Habsburg. They had grown somewhat thoughtful. Then, without warning, it began again, horrible, as though the thing had sprouted wings and was riding towards them on the back of fiery monsters, flaming and shrieking a long drawn-out cry. Here we come! It truly seemed as if an underworld were suddenly seized with the desire to break out through the hard earth. The sound was like a black, gaping abyss, and the sun now appeared to be shining from a darkened sky, glaring down more dazzling than ever, but as through from a hell, not the heavens. The rushing crowd, apparently full of passion, drew closer, and the knights stood their ground. Suddenly they seemed fused together. Iron men held out their lances. Lance upon lance stuck out so mindlessly, firm and unyielding, just the thing you might think for such an impetuous, raging human beast to impale itself on. Here an idiotic wall of spikes, there people half covered with shirts. Here the art of war, the most prejudiced there is, there people seized with helpless rage. There'll never be anything to equal the battering with which these light mountain and valley men, driven and elevated by their fury, now battered their way into the clumsy, despicable wall, smashing and ripping it apart like tigers ripping apart a defenseless herd of cows. Those on horseback were flung down like cardboard, with a crack like that of a paper bag blown up and burst between one's hands. Heads were scuffed by blows, appeared only grazed, yet proved to be bashed in. Blow followed blow, horses were knocked down, the fighting grew more and more frenzied, more violent. The Duke was slain. Would have been a miracle had he not been. Those striking accompanied their blows with shrieks, as though these were only right, as though killing alone was not enough, a mere half measure. End quote. This is how the Swiss writer Robert Walser described the Battle of Sempach on July 9, 1386, the battle that broke Habsburg power in their ancient homeland and paved the way for Switzerland to become a nation. What we'll do in this episode is look at how it came to pass that an army of Swiss militia defeated Archduke Leopold III, one of the most accomplished military men of his time, a man willing to make his knights fight on foot with lances rather than run mindlessly in a wall of arrows, and how he still lost. But before we start, a quick reminder that this show is advertising free. No, really, you will not hear me singing the praises of some product carefully curated for just your specific needs, or more likely, not useful to you at all. Such luxury is ultimately a function of the generosity of a small but very much appreciated band of patrons who have signed up on historyofthegermans.com/support. And this week our special thanks go to Chris O, Alexi G, the always supportive Mike F, Walter E, Stuart Walker, Sergey S and Simona, who've already joined that band. And with that, back to the show. This season is entitled The Fall and Rise of the House of Habsburg. And since here the fall comes before the rise, it is the fall that we really start with. If one tries to understand why the Habsburgs were able to keep a multicultural and multilingual empire together for more than 400 years, an empire that had not one but two capitals in Vienna and Madrid, plus several smaller centers in Naples, Milan, Prague, Budapest and Brussels. An empire that at its height spanned the globe and surrounded its greatest rival, the Kingdom of France. And all that these disparate territories from Lima to Lwów had in common was not one language or one culture or one individual king or emperor, but the unflinching grip of a family that ruled them well into the 19th century, at a time when nationalist movements had long declared their existence obsolete. To understand what made the Habsburgs capable of such an unprecedented feat, it may help to look at the 150 years they had spent in the wilderness, far from the thrones and the vertiginous heights of European politics. When we talk about the fall of empires and dynasties, it's very rarely a case of wily coyote speeding over a cliff and then crashing down to the bottom. Great power blocks do not collapse straight into insignificance. They skid down the mountainside, occasionally grabbing hold of a boulder to rise up for a moment before the next avalanche dislodges them again, until after decades or generations and after innumerable attempts at stabilization they hit rock bottom. We will see when rock bottom is for the Habsburgs. My best guess at this stage of my research is 1471, when Friedrich III sees his Duchy of Austria overrun by his enemies and has to seek refuge in the empire, an empire that had largely forgotten about him and that he had not visited for 28 long years. Now, we've already watched the Habsburgs losing their footing for the first time when King Albrecht I was murdered by his nephew John Perikida. One moment they were en route to become the de facto hereditary rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, and the next they were just another ambitious family in the game of musical chairs that were the imperial elections in the 14th century. But they were still one of the most powerful of these families. In Season 8, when we talked about the period between the Interregnum and the Golden Bull, I described it as a three-body problem, where the Luxembourgs, the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs were roughly of equal power and influence, constantly ganging up 2 against 1. But that three-body problem went away with the rise of Karl IV to the imperial throne and his ruthless expansion of the Luxembourg power base from Bohemia westwards into Brandenburg and the Upper Palatinate, whilst collecting options on Hungary and Poland. Neither Habsburg nor Wittelsbach could compete with that any longer. A further relegation was the exclusion of the Habsburgs from the 7 electors in the Golden Bull of 1356. Much has been made of this, though it is important to remember that neither the Dukes of Austria nor the Counts of Habsburg had ever been part of the College of Electors that had formed since around 1273. So not adding them was maybe not that much of a snub as it might have looked. Still, we know that Rudolf the Founder, the head of the family in 1356, took umbrage and forged the Privilegium Maius that claimed and, thanks to confirmation by the emperor, established a unique rank for the Habsburgs as archdukes with wide-ranging privileges in their own lands, privileges that made them more like kings in their own lands than feudal vassals. So, when Rudolf IV passed away prematurely in 1365, the House of Habsburg was certainly not what it was in 1308, but it was also by no means down and out. There were a major force in the empire, holders of most august titles and, most importantly, united. They ruled Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, the Tyrol, and their ancestral lands along both shores of the Upper Rhine from Schaffhausen to north of Freiburg and Breisgau, as well as much of German-speaking Switzerland. Rudolf's death had come at an inopportune moment. He had been just 27 years old, and his marriage to the daughter of Emperor Karl IV had remained childless. Hence the duchy went to his brothers, Albrecht, aged 16, and Leopold, aged 14 at the time. The Wittelsbachs used this to make a bid for the Tyrol they had ruled until fairly recently, but the brothers defeated Duke Stephen of Lower Bavaria, and the Tyrol stayed in the family. Between the brothers, a clear division of responsibilities emerged. Albrecht, called with a plate, was the elder and interested in administration and finance. Leopold was the military man. So it was Leopold the younger one who achieved the victory in Tyrol at the ripe old age of 17. Such a division of responsibilities can be a recipe for astonishing success. Think Augustus and Agrippa or Bismarck and von Moltke. But it did not work that well in this case. Leopold believed his military prowess demanded a higher status than that of just junior co-ruler. So, in direct violation of the clear provisions left by Rudolf the Founder and his predecessors, Albrecht and Leopold agreed to divide up the Habsburg lands. Leopold received the periphery, That means Carinthia, Carniola, bits of Friuli, as well as the Tyrol and the ancestral lands along the Upper Rhine. Albrecht took the core of Austria and Styria. Still, that breakup was not designed to be permanent. The brothers swore to act in unison, and every member of the family was allowed to use all the family titles, including that of archduke, and in case one branch died out, the other would inherit their lands before any other claimant. So whilst Albrecht then focused on consolidating his power over Austria and Styria, Leopold went off conquering. And he was moderately successful, expanding in two directions. He moved southwards and acquired Trieste. The city actually submitted voluntarily to his rule in order to get rid of the oppressive Venetians. Trieste gave the Habsburgs access to the sea and became the home port of the Austrian navy. Seriously, such a thing existed. But his main objective was to build a connection between the two main Habsburg possessions, Austria in the east and the Swabian ancestral lands in the west. One important first step had been done by his brother Rudolf, who had established a hold over Tyrol. The next important acquisition was the county of Feldkirch, better known today as Vorarlberg, an important road connection to Lake Constance, before it became a vehicle to extract large sums of money from thrill-seeking German and English skiers. Given Salzburg too had come under indirect Austrian rule as per the Privilegium Maius, the Habsburg now possessed a land bridge all the way from Vienna to the eastern shore of the Lake Constance. And with their ancestral lands starting around the western shore of the lake, the grand strategic objective of a contiguous territory going from the western to the eastern border of the empire was within reach. All that was needed to be brought in now were the lands south of Lake Constance and the left bank of the Rhine. And to save you scrambling for a map, let me tell you what the land south of Lake Constance and the left bank of the Rhine is called today: the Swiss Confederation. In 1379, when Leopold was put in charge, the Habsburgs already had extensive possessions in this region. After all, the family had come from the Aargau near Bruck in the first place. They had replaced the former major players in the region, the Kieburgs and the Zähringer, and they held castles and advocacies all throughout these lands. There were 3 free imperial cities here, Zurich, Basel and Bern, but even within those the family had certain rights and supporters. But the recent generations of the family had let things slip. They had lost the position as imperial reeve over the cantons of Uri, Schwyz and Nidwalden. The defeat of an Austrian force at Morgarten in 1315 had further undermined their position. The cities, including Lucerne and Zug, which they owned outright, were less and less willing to yield to the Habsburg administrators' demands. Our man, Archduke Leopold's job was hence to defend the existing rights and reclaim those lost in the previous decades. And that meant specifically to take charge of the main cities in the region: Zurich, Basel, Lucerne, Solothurn, and maybe even the mighty Bern. Each of these cities had a faction that supported the Habsburgs, usually made up of the long-distance traders who believed a mighty lord was better able to ensure the safety of the roads and the Alpine passes. As one can imagine, Leopold's expansionist policy did not remain unopposed. To understand this opposition, we have to take a closer look at this thing that would later become known as the Swiss Confederation. And I'm afraid, much, if not all, the stories about the founding of the Swiss Confederation are entirely made up. Wilhelm Tell did not exist. The Rütli-Schwur did not take place, at least not in the way and at the time it is usually reported. The Bundesbrief may be backdated. Arnold von Winkelried, also probably not a real person. I personally think this is a pity. I would have loved to go on about "One people will we be, a band of brothers, no danger, no distress shall sunder us, we will be free men as our fathers were, and sooner welcome death than live as slaves. We will rely on God's mighty arm, and never quail before the power of man." Then go on to "Through this narrow pass he must come." But, sadly, pretty much every single history of Switzerland I have read is adamant. None of that ever happened. But that does not mean that the emergence of the Swiss Confederation, which very much does exist, is not a great story. Only that the crucial moments were in 1291 or 1315, but 1386 and 1393. But I am racing ahead. We did already have a brief look into the beginnings of the Swiss Confederation in episode 150, Moorgarten and Mühldorf, but let me just briefly recap. When the Gotthard Pass opened up in the 13th century, life for the people living in the Alpine valleys on both sides of the pass changed fundamentally. Having been a forgotten land of subsistence farmers and herders, far from the centers of commerce and politics, they found themselves suddenly in close communication with Italy and southern Germany. Recognizing the strategic importance of the new route, the Emperor Frederick II granted the lands immediately to the north of the pass. That's the cantons of Schwyz and Uri, and possibly including also Nidwalden, imperial immediacy. In other words, these lands became part of the imperial domain and were administered by an imperial governor, a Vogt in German. And this Vogt was initially a member of the House of Habsburg. The inhabitants of these cantons were in the main peasants. There was a local aristocracy, though less numerous than in other parts of the empire. Village communities were close-knit and enjoyed a high degree of autonomy due to the specific conditions of life in the mountains. This hostile environment required building paths and bridges, maintaining forests to protect against avalanches, and required holding a food reserve for the harsh winters. And all this was provided by the local community, not by a feudal lord. And once the pass became a major thoroughfare, the locals found additional sources of income in transporting wares across and offering hospitality to travelers. And they were introduced to lucrative job opportunities in the lowlands. Travelers told them about the incessant wars between the cities and lords in northern Italy, wars that were fought mainly by hired mercenaries. The great condottieri were constantly on the lookout for sturdy young men willing to have a go at anyone they told them to hack at. And these men from the Alpine valleys were ideal for the job. They were used to physical exertion and violence, well, like almost everyone in the late Middle Ages, but what made them so great was that they had no allegiance to any of the parties involved in the wars in northern Italy. They did not care particularly for any of the cities, they had no link to the emperor, and not even worry much about the Pope and his excommunications. The historian Volker Reinhardt places the beginnings of the Swiss Confederation into this context. According to him, the first compact amongst the three cantons, the Bundesbrief of 1291, was actually produced 20 years later, in 1308, and it wasn't initiated by the people of the cantons, but by the emperor and his Vogt. The key event, according to him, was the journey of the Emperor Henry VII to Rome, which we also covered in the podcast. Henry VII was keen to have access to the famous fighting men from the mountains to cut his way south, which is why he appointed one of his generals, Werner von Homberg, as imperial reeve for the three cantons. Von Homberg did indeed exist and was one of the condottieri who made their living in the perennial Italian wars. Reinhardt then goes on to say that Homberg was interested in a more permanent arrangement between the three territories that would make it easier for him to raise larger contingents of soldiers in the valleys. He therefore not only allowed them to draft the Bundesbrief, but actually encouraged it. And as we heard last week, forging and predating documents was commonplace at the time. So it is quite possible that they changed the date of the agreement in order to give the document added weight and credibility. Now, irrespective of when and why the arrangement was made, it is apparent that from the 14th century onwards, the three cantons coordinated their actions and entered into further alliances together. And this arrangement, agreement, alliance was first tested when a Habsburg army came up to the valleys to avenge an attack of the men of Schwyz against the abbey of Einsiedeln. The Habsburg expeditionary force found itself defeated at the Battle of Moorgarten in 1315. This was certainly a crucial event, inasmuch as the chivalric army of knights was beaten by a force that comprised mostly of peasants, even though these were clearly peasants with military experience. What made this possible was in large part the topography, as the armored riders traveled along a narrow road along a lake, whilst the Swiss threw rocks and logs at them from the cliffs above. It is also possible that they used halberds for the first time, a weapon that would become a very effective tool to dislodge and then incapacitate armored riders. In the years after Morgarten, the Habsburgs were preoccupied with their war against Ludwig the Bavarian over the succession in the empire, leaving little room for revenge against these rebellious mountain people. And by the old notion that my enemy's enemy is my friend, Ludwig the Bavarian supported the three cantons against the Habsburgs. He showered them lavishly with all sorts of freedoms, and crucially, when their reeve, Werner von Homburg, died, Ludwig did not appoint a new reeve. As a consequence, the three cantons became de facto free to organize themselves as they wished, with only the emperor as their overlord. And so they did. They gradually removed what existed in terms of noble privileges and dues, so that by 1380 these three cantons consisted almost entirely of free men and women. But the cantons weren't really in anyone's focus unless you were trying to recruit soldiers. Where the Habsburgs, in particular Duke Leopold III, spent their energy was in the cities. These were a lot richer and a lot easier to control than these wild men and women of the valleys. The Swiss cities differed in structure quite considerably from the cities in other parts of the empire. As we discussed in episode 160, the Golden Bull of 1356, one of the basic rules of the Holy Roman Empire was that the cities were banned from inviting local lords to become citizens. The point of this prohibition was to stop cities from acquiring larger territories. This is what had happened in northern Italy in the 11th and 12th century, and had made the communes powerful enough to defy and ultimately defeat the emperors. And the way these Italian cities had acquired their territories, the contados, was by co-opting the local lords as citizens. The lord would then hand over political control of his lands, and in exchange was given a position on the city council, whilst keeping the income from his estates. The Swiss cities defied the ban on co-opting local lords, the so-called Pfahlbürger, which is how in particular Bern and Zurich became veritable city-states with territories that rivaled many principalities. Now, we should not believe that this process was all polite and gentlemanly. It wasn't quite the case that the city council would send a gold-rimmed invitation card to the local knight who would then be so delighted he immediately signed up to become a citizen. What preceded these takeovers was either that the local lord had run out of cash and had pawned his castle to the city, or the city had marched its militia before the castle gates. And these city militias were often well equipped and well trained. In 1375, the French lord Enguerrand de Coucy, the key protagonist of Barbara Tuchman's Distant Mirror, led a strong force of hardened French and Gascon mercenaries into the territory of the city of Bern. On Christmas Day, the city militia attacked them and slaughtered 800 of these veterans of the 100 Years' War. In other words, these city armies were not to be underestimated. And these militias did not only exist in the free imperial cities of Bern and Zurich. Even those who were not, like Lucerne, Fribourg and Solothurn, embarked on a similar expansion policy and established sizable military forces. This city expansion policy brought them into conflict with A, the powerful families of the region, in particular the Habsburgs and the Counts of Savoy, and B, the nobles of Swabia and what would later be Switzerland, who had formed associations to push back against the threat of being slowly but surely dragged under by the cities. As we go through the 14th century, these two developments, the expansion of the cities at the expense of the Habsburgs, and the Habsburg efforts to connect their lands into one contiguous territory from Vienna to Basel, headed for the inevitable clash. It could have kicked off already at the Basel Ugly Carnival of 1376. Basel lies exactly at one of the connecting points between the Habsburg territories in Alsace, the Breisgau, and Switzerland. Hence, one of Leopold's objectives was to extend his control of the city. In that he had to deal with the opposition not just of the city council but also of the Bishop of Basel. Now the bishop was comparatively easy, as he was broke, and so Leopold was able to buy him out. Through this arrangement he acquired Klein Basel, the part of the city on the opposite side of the river. In February 1376, Leopold invited his noble friends to come to Basel for a grand tournament. And since Klein Basel didn't have enough space, he demanded to use the main square in the city itself. The council, which comprised a large pro-Habsburg faction, permitted the tournament to go ahead. But things went pear-shaped quite quickly. The tournament took place as part of the Carnival celebrations. Carnival, for those who are not familiar, is the massive party that takes place in Catholic countries on the last few days before Lent. Given the prospect of 40 days of restricted food choices and moderation in alcohol, Carnival tends to be an exceedingly debauched affair. This is a medieval carnival, not carnival in Venice with masks and Baroque music or Brazilian samba floats. This is, depending on stamina, a 4 to 6 day bacchanal of drinking, dancing, more dancing, and, should there still be some energy left, doing some naughty stuff. It isn't hard to imagine what happened when a drunk crowd is confronted with dukes and knights prancing about on their horses in the market square as if they owned it. The mob stormed the enclosures and the drinking halls of the nobles. Duke Leopold barely escaped on a barge across the river, and many of his guests were apprehended and locked up in the city hall for protection. Still, dozens of knights and their retainers lay dead. The city council blamed the whole incident on the bridge and tunnel people and hanged 2 of them to show its contrition. Nevertheless, Duke Leopold procured an imperial ban over the city, which he then leveraged into a full takeover of the place. Whilst this is going on, the cities and the cantons that would later become Switzerland had moved ever closer together in order to protect themselves against external forces. That's namely Leopold, but also the Counts of Savoy. Ever since Morgarten, the different cities and cantons have signed agreements and alliances. This again, it's nothing unusual. Similar things have happened amongst the cities and territorial princes of southern Germany as well, and even with the peasant republics. In 1370, one of these arrangements, the so-called Pfaffenbrief, took on a different quality. In it, the 3 cantons, Uri, Schwyz and Nidwalden, as well as the cities of Zurich, Lucerne and Zug, agreed a permanent alliance that was to bind them above and beyond other existing obligations. The previous arrangements had always been made for a fixed period and subject to the pre-existing third-party arrangements. That meant under the Pfaffenbrief, Lucerne, which was nominally a Habsburg city, now shed its obligations to the Austrians in their entirety and instead aligned the exercise of political power with the other signatories of the Pfaffenbrief. This was a new type of arrangement. It was permanent and it took priority over all other agreements. Its participants were no longer just allies, but small c confederates. The Swiss constitutional lawyers regard this document as the real foundational step towards the Swiss Confederation. Now, surprisingly, the Habsburgs did not react to this move. They had lost control on Lucerne and also Zug, where their position had been stronger, but still they did not budge. That was in part due to the death of Rudolf the Founder in 1365 and the subsequent wars over the Tyrol and the squabbling between the brothers. But when these conflicts had been resolved, it became time for Leopold III to bring this conflict to a resolution. Basel had been a major success, which he followed up in the early 1380s with the acquisition of 2 counties near Bern. So it was now clear to everyone where this train was heading. In response, Bern, Solothurn, Zurich and Zug entered into an alliance of the traditional temporary and limited kind with a number of southern German cities, promising each other support in case of attack. Leopold in turn firmed up his links with the Swabian nobility on both banks of the Rhine. The signing of this Constance Accord with the German cities encouraged the Swiss to strike. Zurich attacked Rapperswil, Zug the city of St. Andreas, Lucerne co-opted the city of Sempach. All of these had been Habsburg possessions. The war was on. Leopold III called upon all his vassals from Tyrol, from Alsace and the Breisgau. He wrote to his allies, the knightly associations in Swabia and the Alps, and hired crossbowmen from Italy and Flanders. They were all together in his city of Bruck, in the shadow of the ancient family home, the Habichtsburg. As always, numbers are unreliable, but the most likely figure is about 3,000 men, all raring to teach these peasants and townsfolk a lesson they should never forget. And the first town they decided to be educated in the ways of the feudal world was Lucerne. Lucerne then immediately called on the men of Uri, Schwyz and Nidwalden to come to their aid, which they did. Now it seems the other cities who had signed the recent alliances did not appear on the battlefield, or in the case of the German cities, only as observers and mitigators. Now, there are two ways to describe the battle that followed. The first one is from the contemporary sources, and they say that a battle had taken place and they noted who had won. That, I'm afraid, is not suitable podcasting material. Therefore, here comes the more entertaining but maybe less accurate version. Once Leopold had spotted the enemy in an open field near the contested town of Sempach, he asked a group of his knights to dismount and form a strong square, protected by a wall of lances. Within the square, the crossbowmen were to release their bolts into the mass of the enemies. Meanwhile, 2 detachments of heavy cavalry positioned themselves on the flanks, and once the enemy had engaged the center, were to attack the Swiss from the sides. Dismounting the knights and integrating infantry into the strategy was a major move away from the gung-ho approach at Crécy, Poitiers and Mühldorf. But then, the Habsburgs had owed much of their success to their willingness to bend the rules of chivalry when necessary. Plus, this was a tactic that had led French forces to victory over another army of townspeople, those of Flanders, just about 4 years earlier. And initially the plan worked. The Swiss' fierce attacks of the Habsburg line ran again and again into the unyielding wall of lances, and out of the square the crossbowmen sent their deadly bolts into the lightly armored forces of Lucerne and his allies. The story goes that when wave after wave had been broken by the Habsburg resolve, a bear of a man stepped forward, Arnold von Winkelried. Entrusting the care of his wife and his children to his comrades, he rushed forward and grabbed a dozen or more of the enemy's spikes, impaling himself. As he fell, so did the spears buried in his chest, and over the hero's body stepped his comrades, cutting deep in the Duke's phalanx. Their line, broken in a square formation, fell apart. The Habsburg lion went down with his standard bearer. Duke Leopold, who had been in the center of the square, seized the flag from the dying hands of his vassal to once more rally his troops. But it was too late. His forces turning, he was offered the opportunity to flee, but refused, uttering, "Shall I, Leopold, look on from afar as my brave knights fight and die? Here in my country and with my people I will either conquer or perish." His dead body was found the next morning, together with 400 noble knights, whose names the victors carefully recorded on the walls of a chapel they erected over the battlefield. Whether or not this was the way it unfolded, we will never know. The earliest detailed descriptions of the battle date from 1480, almost a century later. Arnold von Winkelried's existence is even less likely, since his deed bears suspicious resemblance to much older Germanic folk tales, and a man of this name appeared in the 16th century as a hero of the Swiss Guard. But what is fact is that the forces of Lucerne, Uri, Schwyz and Nidwalden defeated the army of Duke Leopold of Austria, and devastatingly so. In its wake, the nobility in the south was much diminished. Many families found their sons and heirs did not come back, and lost their lands to territorial princes, including, most cynically, the Habsburgs themselves. Habsburg power in what is today Switzerland was largely wiped out. Not immediately, when the cities Zurich, Bern, Lucerne, Zug and Solothurn continued their expansionist policies. Basel shook off Habsburg control. The local lords, who could no longer hope for meaningful Habsburg assistance, caved, handed over political control and became citizens. In 1388, there was one more battle between the Swiss and the Habsburgs, which the Habsburgs again lost. In 1393, the existing union of Uri, Schwyz, Nidwalden, Lucerne, Zug and Zurich added Bern, Solothurn and Glarus. This old federation would last until 1481, and in that period would push back Habsburg influence all the way to the Rhine River, taking even their ancestral seat, the Habsburg itself. Leopold III's body was brought to the Grand Abbey of Königsfelden, originally built as a memorial to the murdered King Albrecht I. While the Swiss regard Sempach as one of the greatest battles in their history, the Habsburgs developed a very different narrative. As they saw it, the great general, brave fighter and chivalric knight had been murdered through treachery by an uncouth rabble. His heroic refusal to be rescued from the battlefield made him into a martial idol. Over time, the memory of Leopold III got meshed up with that of Saint Leopold, the 12th century Babenberger duke the Habsburgs had already incorporated into their made-up family history. But apart from expanding the family lore, the death of Leopold III was a catastrophe. He left behind four sons who did not get on with each other. Nor did they get on with their uncle and later their cousin from the other branch of the family. So next week we will meet a whole bunch of new Austrian archdukes. William the Courteous, Leopold the Fat, Ernest the Iron, and Frederick with the empty pockets. A further division of the territory was at hand. The Habsburgs were heading downhill at speed. As I said in this family, it is the fall that comes before the rise. And I hope you come along for the tumble, and if you want to go back to some of the wider background of this story, check out episodes 150 about Morgarten, 152 about Margarete Maultasch and the acquisition of Carinthia and Tyrol, 166 about the Great Schism, which overlaid all that went on at the time, and 165 on King Wenceslas the Lazy, who was at least formally in charge of the empire at that time. And if you find all of this worth supporting, go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you can find various options to keep this show on the road and advertising free.